Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends and colleagues around the world. My name is Larry Kelly, and welcome to the fifth session of the inaugural series of the World Affairs program of the MIT Club. Over this past year, it has been thrilling to kick off this new program on the subject of world affairs, democracy, and freedom. The goal is to examine world affairs and to promote the understanding and advancement of democracy and freedom. And today, I am especially thrilled and excited to have as our speaker, Barry Posen, the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT, to talk about grand strategy and how to delve into our current administration's grand strategy, key issues, and the tensions generated. By the way, our event today has over 80 registrants. In today's session, we will address the question, how is the militarily strongest democracy, the United States, defining and attempting to secure its interests in this fractious world? By way of review, our speaker last month was Adam Berinsky, the Mitsui Professor of Political Science at MIT. Adam gave a fabulous and thought-provoking talk on fake news. How can fake news spread, and how can it be debunked? If you missed any of our earlier sessions, there's a link in the chat box to the recordings of these talks. And all of the club's recordings are in that link. The previous World Affairs talks have the blue backgrounds. And now it is my privilege to introduce our speaker, Barry Posen. Barry is an American political scientist with an international relations scholar known for his work in the field of security studies. And Barry is the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT and the Director Emeritus of the MIT Securities Studies Program, and serves on the Executive Committee of Seminar 21, whose remit is to educate U.S. national security leaders. His research focuses on various aspects of U.S. national security and grand strategy. He has made significant contributions to the study of military power, force structure, and the sources of military doctrine. He is known for his critical analysis of American foreign policy, particularly in relation to military intervention and the use of force. Barry's influential book, Restraint, A New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy, published in 2014, argued for a more selective and cautious approach to military intervention and emphasizes the importance of avoiding unnecessary wars and preserving American power and security. By the way, I recently read this book and found it to be extremely informative and very thought-provoking. I had a very hard time putting it down. And so I highly recommend this book. Throughout his career, Barry has contributed to academic journals and policy debates. He has provided insights and analysis on a wide range of security topics, such as military strategy and U.S. foreign policy. And he has been recognized for his expertise and received several awards for his scholarly contributions. Before we start, Barry, please tell us a little bit about your background. You have spent your formative years in many places around the United States. You attended some great schools, Occidental and Berkeley. You have been affiliated with many organizations dedicated to the study of foreign policy, including the Council on Foreign Affairs, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Woodrow Wilson Center, the German Marshall Fund, Dartmouth College's Dickey Center, and the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. How did you get so interested in war? And were there any interesting people during your formative years that had significant influence on you?
Well, I know how I got interested in war and international politics, but it's not even clear to me that there was some, unique chemistry. I've been doing this for 50 years, so I must like it. And I've been really lucky in the colleagues I've had and the places I've been. Like many people my age, I'm about 70, you grew up as children in kind of the backwash of the Second World War. And it was kind of in the ether, as it were. my father and uncle were, served in the military in that war. My mother, interestingly enough, was in USO camp shows and was an entertainer in during the war, and also worked in Washington in the war bonds division, selling war bonds. So this kind of background was there. And then I think my father was very influential on me. He had been a Marine in World War II, and they say in the Marine Corps you're just a Marine forever once you're a Marine. I wasn't a Marine, but I feel like by some magnetic process, the Marine Corps has had a kind of influence on me through him, because he developed a kind of belief that force was a very important thing in international politics. My father, our family is Jewish. He grew up in the South. In the South, this was pre-Christian Zionism. So if you were a young Jewish man growing up in the South, there was a good chance that you were going to end up in a brawl with somebody. And my dad was always willing to do that. He had a reputation for not being willing to brook an insult. Between that experience in the Marine Corps, I think he inculcated in me a kind of healthy respect for essentially military power, for violence in service to politics, against the backdrop of the Second World War and all the horrible things that had happened in it. And then, of course, I'm growing up during the Vietnam War, and if you're the kind of kid who catches an interest in current affairs, every single day there's Vietnam War news, and pretty soon you begin to understand that there's a conscription system, and you may be caught up in that conscription system. I was not, just young enough to miss it. So again, my focus kept coming back to this problem, right? And I guess the final thing is I had a complete fluky kind of stroke of luck when I was in high school in Los Angeles. There was an individual with a PhD in political science who taught an international affairs course in high school, and he taught it at the graduate, not the graduate level, but a kind of undergraduate college level. And of course, I got polluted with the pure milk of realism by way of Hans Morgenthau, because that's the book he taught from. So again, you can see the way there's like a pattern here. I've been drawn into this rather conflictual view of international politics where force plays a really important role. And I think, on the basis of having formed those ideas rather early, I kind of made my career choices and found my way to different research institutes, colleges, universities, professors, etc.
Yeah, well, it's a great story. Boy, you've been very successful too. So let me.
I've been lucky.
Luck counts. Well,
luck does count.
Maybe you're humble.
No, I'm not particularly humble. I just recognize that I've often been lucky.
Yeah. Well, luck favors the well prepared, right?
Yeah, that's what they say.
That's what they say. Yeah. Okay. One last housekeeping detail before we turn it over to you completely. For the audience, we've enabled the chat box for questions, and I'll do my best to get to many of these questions, get them to Barry during the Q&A session after his talk, along with any questions that had been submitted during the online registration. We got a big group today, so we're probably not going to get to all the answers, all the questions, but we'll do as best we can. So I'll be back after Barry's talk. Go for it, Barry.
And Serena is now sharing the slides with the group. Is that correct?
You or Serena?
Barry, you need to share your slides.
I need to start over sharing? Okay, then that's what I will do.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we can. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, got it.
Good?
Yep.
All right. There's the title. So now you know what we're talking about. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about grand strategy in a general sense, what a grand strategy is and why you would want one. And then I'm going to talk mainly about the national defense strategy of the Biden administration, which appeared in a document published at the Department of Defense in late 2022, and a little bit about the national security strategy, which is a document published at the White House. And these are key documents from which one might be able to glean what U.S. grand strategy might be. I'm going to try and assess and critique some elements of the strategy in its own terms, mindful of the fact that my views are somewhat at variance with the administration's. I'll talk mainly about the substance of a critique, but also say something about the form, because just to telegraph up front, these documents have the look and feel of what you would want from a grand strategy. So you kind of have to read them with some care to be able to figure out how the bits actually fit together. But if you just look at what they say and what they say they're talking about, it has the right look and feel. So first of all, what is a grand strategy? How do I think about it? So I view it as a political military means ends chain. And that means ends chain enumerates and prioritizes threats to the national security of the United States. It enumerates and prioritizes opportunities to improve our strategic position. It enumerates and prioritizes means and explains why those means are reasonably connected to the ends we have in view. It explains how all of this is glued together. What are the underlying causal logics? And it sets priorities, because priorities are critical. Most people who study strategy and grand strategy, they stress priorities pretty early in their conversation. And that's basically because one way or the other, resources are always scarce. So I'm just going to show you a couple of artifacts here. It's actually a law that the United States has a grand strategy. We have the Goldwater and Nichols Department of Defense Reorganization Act of 1986. And to reveal my past, I was actually a gopher research assistant for some of the worthies who worked on this, bringing this legislation to fruition. And it is a requirement that there be an annual national security strategy report, a grand strategy that explains what it is we're doing, right? And it's meant to come out with the budget. And the reason it's meant to come out with the budget is because of this idea of scarcity and this idea of priorities, right? So none of this is a coincidence. And this document was not merely written by, 3 senators or 3 congressmen. Essentially, a lot of people in the U.S. defense establishment decided that this was a good idea. And they persuaded congressmen and senators that it was a good idea, right? Now, a strategy also communicates and coordinates, right? And it communicates internally to those who have specific jobs to do that are meant to add up to something, communicates with them and coordinates their activities. It communicates at home to the public and to the Congress, and coordinates, hopefully, congressional action, because Congress has a huge say over the defense budget. It also is meant to communicate and coordinate abroad, because we want to reassure, but also mobilize the efforts of our allies. But we also want to deter adversaries, right? One of the most important things we do is try with our military power to convince challengers not to challenge. We don't want to, we'd like them to fight and win wars if we're forced to fight them, but we really prefer is to not have to fight them at all. And to be able to fix it so we don't have to fight them at all, we have to communicate to the other side clearly what our interests are, something about our capabilities, something about why we would fight in order to deter any challenge at all. And again, just coming back to this question of priorities, they use this term vital. This is the hoary old term vital interests, but what they're really asking for in this document, in this law, is what are the main things we should be concerned about? And they recognize that, a lot of this is global, right? There are worldwide commitments and the capabilities to meet those commitments, right? And then there's the background of the use of all means of the U.S. power, right? And then their adequacy to be able to carry out the strategy, right? So all of these things are meant to happen in these reports every year. Now, the reports don't happen every year. The fact is that most administrations sort of honor this in the breach. Maybe they'll make one of these in the first or second year of a president's term. They might do another one in the last year, or they might wait and see if they get reelected. When the law was first passed, the president was quite assiduous about doing this every year. So the Clinton administration, I think, published 8 of these. And I have a box set if anybody has a desire to see the original documents, they do exist. So we have lots of documents now that do this at different levels of generality, right? And I take it on faith that there are classified versions. I don't carry clearances anymore, so I've not seen a classified versions, but I am a pretty regular consumer of the unclassified versions, and I've suggested to you earlier where it was you could find it, right? Now, the document that comes out of the White House, the National Security Strategy, is basically our foreign policy. It talks about pretty much most elements of foreign policy, but there is somewhat of a stress on military power because in the end, that's the foreign policy instrument in which the United States invests the most. Our investments there dwarf our investments in everything else. The National Defense Strategy is more like what it calls itself, which is to say the place where the political priorities of the president, the enumeration of threats to American interests is married to the defense budget and the capabilities that we're trying to build every year, and the military strategies we're developing for those capabilities, and the way we're deploying those capabilities in peacetime. They meet in the National Defense Strategy and also in a less available document, which we usually don't see anymore, which is the National Military Strategy. So let's dip into a few of these criteria and see how we feel about the strategy. And I'm going to focus mainly on the NDS. Now, one of the things that I found to be of really greatest interest in this National Defense Strategy, this NDS, is its stress on priorities. I mentioned earlier that this is a key thing that grand strategies have to do because of resource scarcity. And you can see, you can read this paragraph for yourself, but they put this in. No one forced them to put this in. They didn't have to put this paragraph in. This paragraph comes towards the end of the document, and they're basically saying that we're trying to do a lot of things. Even our resources are scarce. We have to mitigate risk to the strategy through ruthless prioritization. This is very striking language. You don't often find it, right? And one of the questions I think we want to ask ourselves as we look through bits of the document is, do we see much ruthless prioritization? And do we see many criteria by which we could undertake ruthless prioritization? And I'm telegraphing my answer. I think the answer is no. So their heart's in the right place, but in the execution, implementation, I think they don't really do that well, right? I just want to say that in the background to the specific objectives in the National Defense Strategy is, as I said earlier, the National Security Strategy. And it wouldn't be thorough for me not to give you the flavor of how the administration sees U.S. interests. And I think this may be of interest to you also because you have had so many seminars on democracy and democracy under attack, right? So you can see here that, the ambitions are large, but a little bit airy. Free, open, prosperous, secure global order, right? Outcompeting our rivals to shape that order, which means the order is going to look like the way we want it, not the way others want it. And we're going to do this through this unparalleled coalition of allies and partners, which means we're going to accumulate a lot of countries in the hopes that they can provide leverage in this purpose. But as we accumulate these allies and partners, we also accumulate military projects, right? But I'll come back to this as I go through the talk, because I think there's some tension here between priorities and this propensity to accumulate large numbers of allies and partners to pursue a rather kind of open-ended set of objectives. And this is at the political level. Now we go to the military, into the military strategy, they have to get more specific, and it's not a surprise, right? So the first thing they do in the document is try and talk about how they see the problems in the world, the security environment. And in a way, you sort of look at this and say, well, maybe they're going to choose from these problems and prioritize them so we know where the resources are going to go. I'll show you another slide in a second. This is drawn right from the document. I drew many of these from the document or from the Pentagon's briefings on these documents. So this is the pure milk that you're seeing here. And you can see that, great powers figure prominently. PRC gets pride of place. Russia, number 2. Threats to the U.S. homeland, most of these come from China and Russia, so this is redundant. And then there's the threats that occupied our attention in the last 30 years, North Korea and Iran, which aren't going away. If you're reading the newspaper, we've actually alerted our forces a little bit in the Persian Gulf because the Iranians are being mischievous. And we're down to one little acronym for the problem of the last 30 years, VEOs, violent extremist organizations, right? They still figure as part of the security environment, right? Then you've got some other kind of esoteric things that we can talk about later if you want to talk about them. But this is the environment. How do you get from the environment to priorities, right? And so they actually have a chapter called Defense Priorities. Again, they're doing the right thing, right? And this is how they sort the priorities. And again, you're right back here, defending the homeland, pays to the growing multi-domain threat posed by the People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China front and center. And since I know this is a group that follows current affairs, follows policy debates, you'll be aware that the competition with China has become all-consuming, right? And the president is waiting to go to the airplane to go out to the Far East to work on the competition with China. He's held back here to work on the competition to keep the United States solvent, right? But defending the homeland obviously is important, but PRC is the principal challenger. We want to deter attacks against the US and allies and partners. So already you're seeing that our military power has a much bigger project than securing North America. We're doing lots of other things. And if you look at the budget, that's where most of the money goes. It's going to doing the other things, not to securing the homeland. Prevail in conflict. This is a big objective, because also kind of airy, because prevail has the kind of implication of victory, and both of our principal challengers are nuclear powers. This is a kind of a tall order, how you beat a nuclear power. And again, we're back again dealing with the Russia challenge again, right? So China, Russia, pride of place, interests, threats to allies and partners pretty much everywhere, also deterring attacks on the United States. Pretty big list, but in the priorities list, you notice that some of the smaller countries that we've been dealing with in the past fell a little bit out of the list. They come back later in the document, but I think we're seeing the pure milk of what it is they want to do here. There's still some question here of whether we're going to call this the setting of priorities, because you can see under allies and partners, even if we know who the threats are, the things we want to defend have a kind of a propensity to expand, right? So there's the priorities can disappear fast, right? So now I want to move from the challenges and essentially the interests to talk about the way they talk about means, right? So I mentioned that it's a means ends chain. I take this one-page slide they had called approaches, and we'll call it, a kind of a umbrella terms for some of the means they want to use. And I raised the question here, what do these terms mean? Do they tell us very much, right? Now, this concept of integrated deterrence is kind of a new one, right? I mean, in the past, for years, we always talked about deterrence. I talked about deterrence at the beginning of my talk. Integrated deterrence is meant to capture some special combination of things they're trying to do. When they use the term integrated deterrence, what they mean is integrating all the elements of national power, all the possible coalition partners, all the military power you can muster to present an adversary with a kind of cloud of risks, possible risks and costs that will deter the adversary, whether it's China or Russia, from doing specific things in specific places. And they talk about integrated deterrence in a way that I think is, in some ways, quite productive, which is to say that deterrence is not a force field. In other words, often when people talk about deterrence, it's painted as a kind of a force field. We, the United States, with all our capabilities and all our friends, we deter bad actors everywhere from doing anything. That's obviously not the case. Even with all these capabilities and all these allies, you're trying to bring them to bear on convincing particular adversaries not to mount particular challenges in particular places, right? So that's to the good in this conversation, right? That they're thinking hard about deterrence, and they know that that deterrence requires a strategy, but we still can see from on the basis of the preceding slide that they're trying to deter in a lot of places. There is however, something here buried in their integrated deterrence discussion, as well as in another document that they published along with the National Defense Strategy, which is the Nuclear Posture Review, which is about American nuclear strategy, right? That in terms of deterring threats, they're making a kind of departure from America's Cold War strategy. So during the Cold War, when the United States was facing one great power that just happened to span, the Pacific and the Atlantic, great nuclear power, the Soviet Union, we believe that we had to mobilize the threat of nuclear escalation to deter challenges all along the Soviet periphery. It's not that we didn't invest in conventional power, we did, but we were trying to, we felt that we had, but out of necessity, because of the amount of resources it would require to defend everywhere, to keep the risk of nuclear escalation pretty salient. And even in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which had significant non-nuclear forces, and I worked in that area a bit in the beginning of my career, we didn't plan on a kind of open-ended ability to be able to fight the Russians without using nuclear weapons. We planned on an ability to be able to fight them for a month or two. And if we couldn't stop the war after a month or two, we were going to be forced to either give up the ghost or start, trying to use nuclear weapons to convince the other side not to stop. Nuclear deterrence was central to the way we were thinking, or deterrence through the threat of massive punishment, massive risk and massive punishment. Now, there's another way of thinking about deterrence, which is deterrence through, we call it, the term of art is deterrence through denial, but it really means deterrence through beating the other side at the non-nuclear level. Deterrence through successful defense, or successful defense and successful counteroffensives, right? This is the pre-nuclear world, right? And if you read through all these documents and you look at the way they talk about nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapons, and you look at the way they talk about integrated deterrence, I think it's a fair inference that the threat of nuclear escalation is meant to be on the back of the shelf, and deterrence through denial is on the front of the shelf. So now you begin to see some little problems, some little issues, right? Which is, here we are trying to deal not with one great power, the Soviet Union, but with two, or 1.5, depending on how you think Russia, China and Russia. Global commitments, a growing list of allies and partners, bigger than it was during the Cold War, and an effort to basically manage these problems with deterrence by denial, which basically means a really large and impressive conventional force, right? So this is a kind of priority shift in terms of means, and it's not front and center. They don't fully admit it up front because there are people in the administration who don't agree and people in the country that don't agree. But basically, I think this has become the mainstream defense establishment position on deterrence, and that has significant resource implications, right? From my own point of view, it means that we should be setting priorities more rigorously, even within this strategy. And I don't think they're quite there yet, all right? So this is a big issue. I want to talk about this other idea of campaigning. This is another idea that didn't, in the past, you wouldn't have seen it in documents about the Pentagon's day-to-day activities. Campaigning usually had the implication of, a war in progress, right? So there was, in the United States in World War II, there was a campaign in the Pacific, there was a campaign in the Mediterranean, campaign in Italy, campaign in Europe. It had the implication of a big slug of military operations, but now it's meant to mean something in peacetime. And the question is, what exactly is it meant to mean? And I think what it means, they don't have to explain it very well, but I think what it means is trying to get their arms around the fact that for whatever reasons, the American military is chronically busy in peacetime. It's not merely a, sort of training the way you would want training to happen, or even training with allies the way you might want training to happen. It's showing the flag. It's exercising with allies and partners just to prove that we're an ally and a partner, right? It's also intimidating these different countries around the world that won't go away, like South Korea versus North Korea, right? Trying to reassure South Korea, deter North Korea, trying to reassure Saudi Arabia or Israel and deter Iran. Whenever we worry that deterrence is getting frayed, we really worry that our adversaries are getting a little bit more obstreperous, somebody wants to send a carrier task force or send some troops to a base that we may have in the area, or fly some bombers in the region or something. But the cumulative effect of this is really quite striking. And these are some quotes I drew out of a study that was just published very recently, May 2nd, by the General Accounting Office on the state of readiness of the US military, right? And you can see, for decades, the US is the unchallenged, military power. But in 2018, this is in the Trump administration, people began to note that, we're starting to meet contest in different areas. So we have to struggle harder to retain our advantage. But then there's this point, which I think is critical. Our work, this means GAO's analysis, they've done 4 or 5 different studies, has shown that 2 decades of conflict has degraded US military readiness, right? This is a very important thing to admit, right? It's not a surprise that it comes from the GAO and not the Pentagon, although the Pentagon might also admit that they have a readiness problem, right? And so here you are trying to modernize your forces to deal with these 2 great powers, whom you want to deter by the threat to defend successfully. And you also have a problem that you've been running your forces to death for 30 years, and you're habituated to running the forces to death, right? So they have to do something. They have to think about the day-to-day activity of the military in a much more strategic way. They invent a term of art. They don't really invent any criteria for deciding how to do it. So I don't see a solution to this problem in sight. I think we're in a kind of a tail chase problem here. And I don't really know what they're going to do with it, but I think they know they have a problem. Right? Now, I want to take a second here and do a little excursion on the whole problem of allies and partners, right? Most of the allies and partners that we've taken up themselves have an interest in defending themselves against the competitors that we've identified. And we align ourselves with them because we don't want them to be conquered by China or conquered by Russia, or intimidated by China or intimidated by Russia. But the fact is that many of our allies and partners are quite wealthy. They spend meaningful amounts of money on defense. They don't always get that much for it, right? And the fact is that their forces are there and our forces are here. So most of the things that we could do in their defense, they can do more cheaply than we can do. This is a personal hobby horse of mine, but whether or not you subscribe to a strategy like the kind I've recommended in other venues, or whether you subscribe to this strategy, right? It still seems to me that if you're going to valorize allies and partners as interests and as assets, then you need a pretty serious discussion of how you're going to mobilize and integrate their military power. Now, those issues are discussed in the document, and you can go look at it for yourself and decide if I'm being fair. But I think this part of the allies and partners problem, mobilizing and motivating the allies to do more and do it better in their own defense, I think this is understated in the document. I think it's still somewhat understated in our policies. And I think if deterrence through denial of these 2 potential adversaries across the globe is going to be America's strategy, then the allies need to do more. And I'm not sure they've really figured out a way to get them to do more. They have some ideas, they have some lines in the water, but it's early days, and I'm somewhat underwhelmed by what I'm seeing, right? Okay, and I want to come to the question of military requirements. So here we're getting to where the rubber meets the road, which is how they think about capabilities. Now, I'm not going to try and drag you through some count of tanks and planes and aircraft carrier task forces or anything else. This is the big lumpy way that they have of thinking about, packages of capabilities, packages of forces, military projects that they want to be able to do. And I think if you kind of read between the lines here, again, this is from the National Defense Strategy, Chapter 7, right? You can see that this is a pretty demanding set of capabilities that they're trying to achieve, right? They want to defend the homeland. We've talked about that. Maintain strategic deterrence. We've talked about that. These things are not that hard to do because we have big oceans between us and other countries and relatively cooperative neighbors to the north and south, and a big nuclear force, which actually doesn't cost us very much. It's not that demanding to deal with threats to North America directly. It's these other things, right? So this prevail in conflict means prevail in a big conflict, either in Asia or in Europe, with either Russia or China, right? So they want a capability to do that. While they're doing that, they want a capability to deter opportunistic aggression elsewhere while the US is involved in that major war. So you want to be able to deter a second war, again, mostly deterrence through denial. And that second war is either Russia or China, depending on whichever one came first. Still have the ability to be able to deal with a small scale, short duration crisis, which means a fight, without impairing high-end war fighting, which means you want to be able to do a little fight without impairing either of these other two capabilities. And you want to do all this campaigning, right, that I talked about, right, of, I call it showing the flag, but it's more than that. That makes light of it. It's a lot of, wear and tear on the ships and planes, and that's why they're talking about these readiness issues, right? So when they get down where the rubber meets the road and they start talking about what they want from specific force packages, you can see it's pretty big things, which kind of takes you back to the question with which I started with this. They say they need ruthless prioritization. You can see why they would need ruthless prioritization, right? They're trying to do a lot of big things in a lot of places. And the problem I have with the document is that I'm not seeing the ruthless prioritization or the criteria for setting priorities ruthlessly. Now, it could be that, they know they should engage in ruthless prioritization, but there's a different answer which the US defense establishment sometimes throws off, and it's this one, right? Which is just keep growing the defense budget, right? So this is the fiscal year 24 Biden request. Here you can see where they think they're going to be in the out years, fiscal year 28. This is $900+ billion a year. We know that the Congress has a tendency to add a few billion to prove their bona fides every year and to pursue their favorite projects. So it's quite likely that, one answer is $1 trillion+ defense budget. And this comes back to the observation I made much earlier, right? Which is, do you think that resources are scarce or not? Do you think that this is the answer, right? So I just want to show you two other slides before I quit. I'll skip on that one, but there's this one, which is the kind of, if you stand back from all this, you do wonder what the problem is. The U.S. is just a simple comparison of defense spending that they do in the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. This is defense spending at exchange rates. The United States is spending, in the year they did this, was spending about $800 billion a year. This is from the Peterson Foundation by way of SIPRI. China and Russia together is barely spending half what we're spending. These other countries, most of whom are allies of the United States or neutrals like India, are also spending quite a bit. Given all the money that's already being spent, you kind of wonder why the situation in these documents is portrayed as grimly and as urgent as it's portrayed. So this is a question. I'm not going to provide an answer. We can talk about it later. Some people will get interested in this slide, some people don't. So I'm going to close now. I've already talked longer than I intended, and I apologize for that. This is a new term I'm trying to invent. Bottom line after babbling for a long time, blab instead of bottom line up front. I think the strategic priorities in the document are somewhat unclear. U.S. strategic objectives are very great, perhaps larger than during the Cold War. Commitments abroad may tend to grow because we were valorized allies and partners. We seem to want more of them. It's going to further water down our ability to set priorities. The military strategy stresses deterrence by denial and underweights deterrence by punishment. This may be desirable. We may all want to do it, but it's inherently expensive. It requires significantly more effort from allies and partners, but there's not a lot of messaging on this problem of motivating them. Day-to-day military efforts to deter and reassure are costly. They require more discipline. No real criteria for doing that. And finally, there is this riddle or puzzle, which was we already significantly outspend our rivals. Is the situation as dire as the document suggests, or are we just really bad defense managers? So with that, I'm going to stop, and maybe I'll leave share screen up for a while in case somebody wants to refer to a slide, and I'll turn it over to whoever has the moderating duties now.
Barry, thank you so much. Great presentation. So we'll move into the Q&A section. How would you, where does restraint fit into this? What are your suggestions for restraint?
I think the United
States,
States,
the allies to belly up.
Well, I've seen jawboning over the years in an effort to get the allies to pony up. To be fair to the administration, this is a moment where it looks like they may be having a little luck. Japan has decided to increase its defense spending to 2% of GDP. They have some plans for how they're going to spend that money that make sense, and others that make less sense to me. There's this strange agreement with the Australians to try and work with the British to produce nuclear attack submarines for the Australian Navy to operate. Don't know if that's really going to work out, but it's something. The European allies are stepping up to provide some of the resources to support the Ukrainian military effort, and some are improving their defense capabilities, but others are not moving as fast as you might hope. And Germany in particular, I think, is a question. Germany has a very serious problem with how it spends its money. They're extremely inefficient as far as we can tell. And they're not increasing their rate of defense spending all that quickly. And they're not taking what I would call emergency measures. So something is happening. I think the administration deserves some credit, and the Russians and the Chinese deserve even more for scaring them into doing more. But I think we're going to have to do a lot more. So I have argued for quite some time that European countries are rich enough relative to Russia, good enough at producing military technology relative to Russia, that I think the Europeans can carry most of the burden of direct defense in Europe against Russia. And I think that that's the direction we should be moving in, right? And I don't think we're going to move in that direction by asking them. I think the only way to move in that direction is by telling them. So we have to actually have a plan to draw down the capabilities that we acquire for that mission, and use that money either to deal with China if we think that there's a dearth, or if the president and the Republicans are going to come to some new agreement to reduce the rate of growth of US spending overall, then this could be the bill payer, as they like to say in defense politics, for that agreement. But it's not going to happen by asking. It's going to happen first by the United States making a judgment that the risks and costs to American national security, by essentially making the Europeans responsible for their own defense, are not very high. And I think they are not very high. And I think the gain for us through that strategy is significant, right? And that's the kind of thing that I argued for in my book, but you would never get this administration to accept that. But they will accept the idea that you need much more energetic burden sharing, but I'm not sure they have a theory about how to get there. And it's to get there is going to require year after year of sustained effort. And what tends to happen historically when we've done this is we work at it for a year, then we get bored and we go do something else. The Allies spend more for a year or two, then they get bored and they go do something else. If the projects are as big as I've painted them, and the Chinese are as dire a threat as they're portrayed, then I think they got to work much harder at this than they ever have in the past.
They working harder being our administration or the
Or
European?
the Biden administration, for that matter, whoever replaces them.
Yeah. We've got a lot of questions about China. Maybe let's focus.
Yeah,
on-
it's not my strong suit, but let's try.
Yeah, okay. What how does the grand strategy of restraint apply to the ongoing U.S.-China tension? Is this another cold water with the zero-sum calculus of the past, or can we look for a new paradigm? Somewhat related, what might be a more productive strategy for engaging with China rather than the confrontational one being pursued now?
Yeah.
We seem to be on a collision course with Taiwan. How do you think it will be resolved, or will it? Yeah, so maybe China there.
That's 3 or 4 China questions.
Yeah. Well, they're all
None of which can I provide you easy and comfortable answers to. So at first, there's a problem inside the Biden grand strategy with their affect towards China, right? And they understand that there's a problem, and but they address it only by arm waving, because I think there is no answer, right? And that is, they've decided that China is a really, really serious across the board threat. Now, I'm sure that I agree that China is a growing power with growing interests, but I don't think I quite agree with them on their characterization of China as this across the board threat to the liberal world order, right? I tend to view China as a typical great power that has interests, and the interests are stronger closer to home, and they wane as they go farther away. They want to have influence in international politics. Their desire for more influence grows with their power. This is the way great power politics has always worked. The administration, I think, tends to characterize the competition with China much more as a kind of good versus evil, right? It's authoritarians versus liberal Democrats. Now, they may only be adopting that style because they think it mobilizes or that it simplifies. But if you look across the board at their policies, it appears that China is being confronted on every dimension. So it's being confronted on an economic dimension, on a technology dimension, on a military dimension, on an overseas influence dimension, ideological dimension, internal governance. The Chinese do some ugly things internally. We're in a position to be able to complain about them, but not really get the Chinese to do anything about them. So this is the full court press. And yet, in the same breath, the administration will say, but of course, we have this other problem in the world that our foreign policy has to deal with, which is collective bads, like climate change, which we all have to experience together, whether we like it or not.
Right.
And if we're going to do anything about it, we have to do something about it together, whether we like it or not, right? And their attitude is, we're somehow going to be able to work very cooperatively with China on climate change or pandemics, while maintaining this full court press competition with them on every other dimension. And their answer would be, well, the Chinese have as big an interest in we do as doing something about climate change. And I'd say in principle, that's right. But in practice, I think it's very hard for the two parties to sit down and cooperate on that dimension, which involves, dividing actual costs of adjustment, right? While they're busy competing really intensively, full bore in every other, right? So that's on them to solve, because they've decided to go about this in this way. Now, if I'm standing outside the strategy thinking about, well, how would I manage this? I'm not going to tell you that I have a well worked out Solomonic way of dealing with China. I don't believe that I do. I've been unwilling to do what so many of my colleagues have done, which is somehow effortlessly shift from being experts on counterinsurgency to experts on China, or experts on Islamic terror. I mean, I won't assume that mantle, right? But I will, just treating China as a normal great power, say, look, it's a nuclear weapon state. It's got 3 or 4 times our population. Its GDP at market prices is not past ours, but at purchasing power parity it has. They're devoting a lot of resources to science and technology. For all the talk about competing with China, they don't have a theory about what does an equilibrium look like, for much less what does an end state look like. It's clear that we're not going to roll over them. And they're not going to simply say, the world order as you Americans defined it is entirely acceptable to us. We'll follow your rules. That's not going to happen. So my view is we have to find a way to share the planet with these people. And some of that's going to be competitive. And we have friends and allies who matter to us, who live close to China. We're not just going to throw them all under the bus. But at the same time, we have to be somewhat sensitive to the fact that, we're right up in China's face. And our alliance system is right up in China's face. And if anybody tried to do that to us, we'd try and stop them. I mean, that's what the Bay of Pigs was about. That's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was about. So, it's a strange concept for a realist to advance, but embedded in the realist practice of international politics is a certain empathy with the other guy, right? You have to know say something about the interests of the other side and try and, you may not even want to meet them halfway, but you've got to make a deal, right? And I think that we're not in a deal-making mood right now, and neither are the Chinese, for that matter. And I think it'd be better if each of us tried to ease off the intensity of the competition right now, right? Because running willy-nilly to a kind of a second coming of the Cold War, this seems to me like a crazy idea, in the sense that the Cold War wasn't so great. I lived through it. I mean, there were scary times. And if you could try and manage great power relations even a little bit differently, shouldn't we think about it? So that would be my first order response.
Yeah, so would we give something up? What would we give up? I agree with your comments about a realist. A realist has to.
We have to stop trying to move the goalposts.
Yeah.
China recoils very badly when the people try and move the goalposts. If they think they have an understanding with somebody, status quo ante, even if it's not written in treaty, and then they perceive the other side as moving the goalposts, they tend to react very badly. My colleague Taylor Frabel wrote a wonderful book about Chinese foreign policy, or award-winning book. And it's the main theme over and over again is, don't try and move the goalposts on these people, right? Everybody who's tried ends up with a problem. This is not to say the Chinese are nice or that they won't try and move the goalposts. They might, they do, but you want to be careful when you decide to move the goalposts. So the question around all revolves around Taiwan right now. I mean, when America talks about China as the pacing threat, blah, 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 there's one place where we're talking about having a brawl with China. There's one place where everybody I know who's working on military simulations and combat models and war games, if you read about a leak about a war game, it's a war game about Taiwan.
Right.
And,
right.
We don't even have an alliance relationship with Taiwan, because we formally gave that up in order to manage our détente with China, to manage our competition with the Soviet Union back in the day, right? And we conceded that there was one China. We also stipulated that one China should be achieved peacefully and not martially, and that in the Taiwan Relations Act, that we would continue to help Taiwan have the defensive capabilities it needed to defend itself, right? But if you look at the narrative that we are offering today, we're offering a narrative that says to China, really, Taiwan's never going to be a part of China again, right? We're going to keep strengthening Taiwan militarily. We're going to essentially say to the Taiwanese that we, the United States, without a treaty commitment, would defend them, which is what President Biden has lapsed into saying many times. He's been criticized by even his own administration officials for doing it. They always try to walk the cat back. But if you look at across the panoply of our policies, look at what American politicians do. Look at Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. All of these things are saying to the Chinese, we're moving the goalposts. We're moving reunification with Taiwan farther and farther away from you. We're creating more and more insurance for Taiwan to do what it wants. This is not a good message to send to China.
Wasn't the expectation and the hope when Nixon went to China, and subsequent to that, when we let China join the World Trade Organization, that the liberalization that's happened over the last 30 years and the growth in the GDP, and especially the growth in the GDP per person, per capita, would allow a liberalization of politics.
The temporal order is wrong. The temporal order is wrong.
Okay.
Right. Nixon's approach with China had nothing to do with an expectation of China becoming democratic. You can go look at the original documents.
Yeah.
Right. Nixon was a hard-bitten realist.
Yeah.
And his theory about rapprochement with China was, this is going to be a great power. We can't keep them out in the cold forever. Right. Yeah. And then the second thing was something that he discovered quite by accident, was just that every time the Russians, the Soviets, heard a rumor that we were talking to the Chinese, they became apoplectic, and the light went on, and Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon said, aha, we can mobilize this against them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. And forget the Nixon part.
So
we'll let them join the trade order.
And that's much later, right? And our commitment to the one China policy antedates the World Trade Organization business, right? The trading relations that came later in the post-Cold War period, some of that was predicated on a hope or a dream that capitalism would make China liberal.
Yes.
Right.
That's where I was.
That's true. Many people entertain that idea. Right.
And
now, you could say that was completely fatuous. I have friends who argue this was one of the most fatuous things ever done, and Donald Trump believes it was one of the most fatuous things ever done. I personally am more agnostic about it, and I don't think myself that we could have kept China out in the cold in terms of economic exchange with the rest of the world, even had we believed that economic exchange would make no difference in China's internal form of government, because the China market, as China began to liberalize, was just going to be too rich for people to ignore. And you can see it today, right? Even today, when the European allies feel obliged to make it appear to us that they are in sync with us in Asia, which they often do. Nevertheless, Macron wanders off to China and says, well, we don't exactly agree with the American policy in Asia. And it's clear that the Germans, from an economic point of view, they don't exactly agree with the American policy in Asia either. Now, they're all concerned about China as a challenge from the business world, and China as a security challenge, as a political challenge. They're concerned. They are not naive. They also don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This, as a trading relationship, it's been extremely lucrative, right? So my own view is that it would have been nice had economic opening made the Chinese more liberal. We had theories in the West advanced by American philosophers who believed that liberalism travels with the rise of the bourgeoisie, which travels with economic development. It wasn't an awful gamble to make, right? If that was the gamble you made, right? That was the gamble, that the reason why some people made it. But my own view is, whether we made the gamble or not, China was going to get on the path to modernization and economic development and was going to become a great power competitor, right? And that was baked in the cake. So it might be nice to view their prosperity as a gift from us. I don't think it was a gift from us. I think maybe the rate at which they achieved it and the level which they achieved because of the relationship with us. But the basic trajectory, I think, was going to happen, right? And we're still back to the original question of how we're going to deal with those folks, right? And the understandings on Taiwan were not predicated on the assumption of liberalization through trade, right? They were based upon the hard-nosed calculation of what our power and security interests were.
So how do we get China to liberalize?
It's a problem, right? I mean, Americans believe that this is within their purview, right?
No,
every country in the world has to find its way to democracy on its own. We can't find the way to Chinese democracy, right? Taiwan has found a way to democracy. It wasn't because we told them how to do it. I mean, it was an autocratic government run by Chiang Kai-shek,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
The
Same thing happened in South Korea, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So, and we've tried to democratize many countries by coercion, and it hasn't been successful. We spent the last 30 years doing it. Right. Countries have to find their own way, and it's extremely difficult. Right. People have to remember that when America comes to visit with its ideas, which it views as universal, right? Every time we show up, those ideas have made in America on them, in part because we put made in America on them. They, in fact, are universal ideas, but we stamp made in America on them. And we are living in a new age of nationalism.
Right.
Nationalism was quiescent for a long time for some reasons, but nationalism never remains quiescent for very long. Nationalism is now even re-emerging as a kind of powerful emotional force in our own country with a very distinctive view of what the US nation is, and it's not pretty, right? So we have intense nationalism in China, intense nationalism in Russia. Ukraine is surviving because of intense nationalism in Ukraine. A more nationalistic and more conservatively nationalistic Zionism in Israel. Extreme nationalism in Poland and Hungary. We're in some weird renaissance of nationalism. So if you're trying to come to a country with democracy in a box, made in America, in an age of nationalism, they're going to tell you to go home. We'll find our own way to our own form of government, right? So I just think this is a non-starter. It's not a practical way to organize American foreign policy these days. And in fact, I think it's a counterproductive way to organize American foreign policy.
So your prescription is to wait.
Yeah, you have to wait. And I don't want to say that we're going to apply containment to China, because China's not an easy country to contain. Kennan's idea on the Soviet Union was contain them and wait for the Communist Party to implode, right? And some people still believe that we could contain the Chinese and wait for the Chinese Communist Party to implode. And maybe that is the strategy, right? But this seems to be a more dynamic competitor than the Soviet Union was.
Well,
and the party seems to be more adaptive than the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was, right? So this waiting for them to collapse as a police state or as a totalitarian system, it could be a really long wait. We have to live with them on the planet while we're waiting, right? So it doesn't mean we have to speak of their system with admiration. It doesn't mean that people in our society shouldn't call them out on some of the ugly things they do in Xinjiang and other places. But as a government-to-government problem, we have a lot of really serious business on the positive side to attend to, and a lot of really serious potential catastrophes that we need to avoid, right? So I think we need to focus on those where I think we can do some work, because great powers have managed to do work together in the past, even when they've been rivalrous. It could all end very badly, of course.
Well, let's hope not. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Given that we spend a lot more than our rivals, is there some kind of effectiveness metric that could be used for comparison for our allies and partners? In other words, if we spend 2x a rival, are we getting 2x more powerful? Are we getting our money's worth? Should we be holding our rivals or our allies to?
It's a great question. Right, it's a great question, and I keep telling these Cold War anecdotes. Back in the day, in the Cold War, starting in the Carter administration, the Carter administration actually made a serious effort to get a more equitable sharing of the defense burden with the NATO allies.
Yeah.
And they had something called the long-term defense program, where before they decided to commit to 3% real increases in defense in the United States, we insisted that all the allies commit to 3% real increases annually at the same time. So that was metric one. But metric two was we had a regular open source and classified assessment of the allied contributions to the common defense. And you can actually go read the old ones at the online Department of Defense archive. It's called Allied Contributions to the Common Defense. Now, for some reason, I don't know what they were thinking. Early in the Bush administration, they canceled these documents, claimed they were going to find some other way to measure contributions, and never did anything, and the whole effort died. But for 3 or 4 years, we had ways to address whether or not the allies were holding up their end, and we invented them, right? So, we divided combat aircraft into, really new, somewhat new, and pretty old. And we counted them on those categories, we aggregated, and then we compared them to the Soviets. This is not a pretty way to do force comparisons, but it gave you something. We used to score the modernity of ground combat equipment, then assemble composite scores for the Allies and compare their composite scores to ours and to the composite scores of the Warsaw Pact, right? To see what things looked like. We would look at spending, we look at people under arms, right? We divided the spending when acquisition versus operations versus personnel. So we had an effort. It wasn't perfect. It was far from perfect, but a lot of ingenuity went into it, and it was updated every year. So there was a process that was unleashed where states knew we were going to be looking, we were going to be asking questions. There was going to be naming, there was going to be shaming, right? So in principle, there was a way to do this. They had some luck, right? Now, the whole project petered out when Reagan was elected, in part by our choice, which I thought was not very smart, right? But there are ways to proceed here, right? Now, if you're going to ask me to explain to you why our defense spending looks so great and somehow doesn't seem to be up to the problem of addressing these competitors, there could be many theories. One could be is that, in fact, we are up to addressing these competitors. We just spend our money differently. And we have a different theory of how to generate combat power. It could be that, right? There was always the old quantity-quality debate.
Right.
So, look at, just for fun, look at the price of some of the munitions we've sent to Ukraine. The Javelin missile, which everyone loves, and is a pretty deadly and effective piece of equipment. It's hard not to admire the engineers who built it. But nevertheless, it's $100,000 a shot, right? And one of the things we know that happens is, friends of mine who are in the military will say, you give the troop a weapon, they're going to use it. So we devised this weapon to kill a $2 or $3 or $4 million tank, but if the only target in front of you is a $500,000 20-year-old armored personnel carrier, you're going to use it against that, or a bunker or whatever. So we do go long in very expensive solutions to problems, right? And in some cases, it looks like it pays. In other cases, you scratch your head and go, is this really going to work out? So the F-35 is a fine airplane, and works wonders, on exercises, works wonders in simulations. On its best day, it probably, if you have 50 or 100 of them, you're going to outclass several hundred of the aircraft the other side has. But it's an awfully finicky airplane to look after. It's an awfully hard airplane to learn how to fly. And a week or two into the war, are they all gonna still be flying? Not because they were shot down, but because it takes a whole lot to keep this thing tip-top, right? A whole lot of resources, right? So there's a lot of things we go along on that aren't obvious. Some of them may be smart. Some of them may not be so smart. Some of them may be smart for the things we've been doing for the last 20 years, but not so smart for some of the wars we think we might encounter. There's some really big issues here, right? And I'm not going to say that I have the answer to those issues. These are issues that people who are, in the business of everyday defense planning have to address now.
Yeah, you talk about big expensive projects and big expensive pieces of equipment and so forth, and aircraft carriers and whatnot. And it's reminiscent of the Ukraine taking down Moscow's pride of the fleet.
Well, that was never that great a ship.
Well, but it was,
And it was pretty old.
but it was their big one, right? It was the
Yeah,
biggest one in that fleet.
It was a big one, yeah.
And they took
Yeah.
it down with one missile, right?
Yeah.
Maybe two.
Well, one or two, although this is where you get to some of these kinds of issues, right? So
So
I'm not sure which generation that warship was, but
yeah.
the Americans invest enormous amounts of resources in ship survivability.
Yeah.
And in the ability to repair damage on the ship so the ship can make it back to dry dock and be fixed if it's hit, right? There were generations of Soviet ships, and there are now possibly some of the Chinese ships. They're built a little tinnier than that. So they look very ferocious from the outside, but some of the costs that you may not see is not there, that it is for the survivability of a ship after it's been hit, right? Some of those costs are not obvious. You don't know whether they've paid them or not. And things like that cost you a lot.
Well,
right?
we're certainly seeing that in their tanks.
Yeah. The Russian tanks tend to go up like a Roman candle.
Yeah, so
Right.
Potemkin ships. Huh?
Could be.
Yeah.
Some were.
Yeah, there's a comment in the chat about we make billion-dollar bombers, submarines, and so forth, but low-cost devices could be effective. And perhaps, boy, drones are cheap, right?
Yes, well, this is the problem, right? And in some cases that inexpensive against expensive or somewhat expensive against really expensive works in your favor. And in some cases it doesn't. So the best example is Taiwan. I think the Taiwanese probably could stop a Chinese amphibious assault, or if they can't do it now without spending very much money, they could put themselves in a position to do it, because amphibious ships, ships that are full of marine-like forces with their weapons coming across the Taiwan Straits are potentially very vulnerable to anti-ship missiles, right? And you might be willing to pay several $1 million for an anti-ship missile to destroy a $300 or $400 million or $500 million or $1 billion amphibious assault vessel, right? And the advantage there is with that small weapon, not necessarily cheap, but with a weapon that's much less expensive, easier to hide, useful basically for one thing, which is defense. And in general, defense is easier than offense. So there are places where, there's lots of leverage to be had, right? But we're often not in that position. We're often in the position of wanting to go kick in the door of places and tell people how it's going to be. And we're often the ones on offense, and we build ships to try and survive in very, very contested environments. And that's a very expensive thing to do. Not even clear if we've been successful. We won't know until we test them.
So here's another question that came in. Should we try to deny advanced electronics technology to China? And what do you think of our current effort to do so?
This is beyond my expertise. It's just simply beyond my expertise. I understand what the motivation is.
Yeah.
And I think on all the dimensions that we've selected for technological competition, we have reason to not want to give away things cheaply and not want to allow China to close gaps quickly. But at the same time, I think we do want to be, somewhat careful about conveying the message to the China that in our eyes, we're going to make it's our objective to ensure that they're second-rate power forever. It might be that it is our objective, but it's probably not a fully achievable one. So I think there might be some trade space in there where you can trade in some areas and not in others, and maybe buy yourself some time and some advantage in some areas while giving the Chinese hope in others. But this is way beyond my actual knowledge of the technology.
Yeah, well, the electronics, boy, AI and chat GPT and everything and robotics,
There's a lot coming up down the
moving very
pipe.
quickly.
Yeah, things are moving very quickly. There's no reason to believe the Chinese are going to sit on their hands.
Yeah, if they don't have the processing power, it's harder to do.
Yeah, but that's right, and at least as far as I understand the matter. But there's a book that I've started to think a lot about lately that I always thought was a little caricatured, a little stylized. You may know the book. It was a business school classic, The Innovator's Dilemma.
Oh yeah, sure, yeah,
Clay Christensen, yeah.
yeah.
And I have this lingering concern now that if we block these areas enough, we're driving the Chinese into a different innovation space, and we may not like what we get.
Yeah.
Right. People are already saying that the Chinese are saying, okay, you won't let us into the commanding heights of chip design. We're already in the plain vanilla day-to-day world of chip design, and we are just going to crush you there. Right. We're going to dominate. We're going to have massive production capabilities. We're going to have the best price. And anybody who wants to produce consumer electronic goods, they're going to have to come to us. Right. Well, that's a pretty interesting place to be, I suspect. And it's probably a business that you can leverage into your own ability to scale the commanding heights, or maybe even find a different way to do things, right? So my view is, people should be asking a question that, again, this is way out of my own league, but does some of the technology trade with China bind them with silken cords? And you start cutting the silken cords, you're basically, you're making them mad, and you're driving them into other innovation spaces, and they have the energy, they have the capital, they have the people, they have the brains. They're not just going to sit still and take it, right? It's like pressing on a balloon, right? So I don't necessarily expect this project of ours to end well in terms of the way it's conceived at the moment, but I've already stipulated this is way, way, way out of my ballpark.
This project isn't going to end well. You mean
project we're trying to squeeze them out of every high-end technology that's on the horizon, where we still have some leverage. We're going to pull that back, right? We're waging a kind of economic preventive war, right?
Yeah.
And like most preventive wars, I mean, we've had discussions about this, and I'm not going to go into it now, but
right.
In a way, it's too late.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In a way, it's too late.
Yeah. Well, one of the audience members brings up the aging issue, and the 421 problem, and the population has peaked, and the working part is peaked.
Well, except that every major power is facing an aging issue.
Yeah,
we all are.
Yeah. Well, with a lot of immigrants in the U.S. So.
Yes, and suddenly we've decided to kill that goose that lays the golden egg.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Barry, this has just been fabulous. There's a couple more questions here, real quick. What are the credible sources? What do you read for reliable information? Who do you trust? One of the things that Adam talked about last time was that truth comes from reliable sources delivering, that's delivered securely. Where are you? What do you? You have to think, huh?
I think it's a hell of a problem because I don't think even reliable sources delivering information securely are necessarily entirely reliable. All right, because there is such a thing as PAC journalism.
Mhm.
And there are, I used to, back in the day in the Pentagon, there used to be they used to publish what they call the Pentagon clips, which is to say there was a little room in the Pentagon. They would get all the early papers. They would clip all of the stories
yeah.
that had any meaning to the Pentagon.
Yeah.
They would produce a Xerox, and it'd be the first thing you'd look at your desk in the morning. Even people who had really high clearances would look at the clips before they looked at anything. Well,
Yeah.
I used to have friends who would give me the clips, and for 1 year I worked in the Pentagon, I used to see the clips. And one of the things you would often notice in the clips, you'd have byline New York Times, byline Washington Post, byline Wall Street Journal, byline. Everybody had the same story. Everybody had the same spin. Everybody quoted the same mouthpieces, right? And you see this today. So, I find that in covering, just trying to inform myself enough to be able to, babble, as I say in the slide there, I look at 4 or 5 news sources a day, and I look at them all skeptically. I look at the Financial Times every day. I look at the New York Times every day. I look at the BBC every day. I look at Reuters every day. Of late, I look at the German media, Deutsche Welle, their website. I often look at them, right, just to get a European perspective. I'll look at the Wall Street Journal from time to time. I receive, there is a new defense clipping service that's done by the Defense News, and they sell it to most people, but they seem to send it to me because I've been nice to them a few times. And then I'll list 15 or 20 defense stories that are in different papers every day, and I look at those, right? I also go to the source. I mean, I'll go read congressional hearings. I go to the Pentagon website. If I want to know about the defense budget, I go to the comptroller of the Pentagon's website and read the defense documents, which are boring, but can be informative, right? There are institutions abroad whose work I read, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, although I have my issues with them. There's some really good defense analysis, believe it or not, that's done by the Swedes. The Swedish Defense Research Agency has a group doing defense analysis, and they publish a lot in English, and some of their analysis is quite good. And their analysts, I like their analysts. Their analysts are humble, right? They were the first analysts who had talked about the Soviet threat over the last few years to publicly say, well, we overstated, not the Soviet threat, the Russian threat, we overstated the threat. So, but you have to search and you have to compare. And when you begin to see the same story coming out of all these places, you want to ask yourself, why is that? Sometimes I go and read the defense, press conferences. I read the press conference verbatims. And sometimes you can read the press conference verbatims. You know where the story comes from. They all go to the press conference. They repeat whatever they're told. They ask no questions, right?
Or they edit,
Yeah.
They take selected parts. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I do this almost full time, but this is not easy for me. So if I think what you really want to do is pick your issue and consult multiple, sources with good reputations. You do, I think now, as Adam says, want to be careful about the actual vector because people can doctor things. And then you have to do your own tests for consistency, right? You just have to ask, does this really make sense? Is anyone really asking hard questions here? Is the press just repeating what they're told, or are they asking hard questions? Are there any patterns here that are inexplicable? Right. And I see them all the time. I won't go into it chapter and verse, right? So it's not easy, right? And I don't think everybody can be well informed of everything. I don't claim to be, right? This is why I resist becoming an instant China expert, because I know how hard it is,
There are too many issues to pick from, though.
Yeah, you have to pick your issues. This is
Yeah.
why I work mainly on transatlantic security issues now. I stay
Yeah.
away from the other
Yeah.
regions.
Yeah.
And that's a place where I think there's money to be made for the United States, where we actually could do something that could save us some bucks.
Yeah. Yeah. Cost cutting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about some advice for people who want to get more involved or learn more about world affairs? What advice would you give them?
Well, find a newspaper that has a lot of international coverage. By the way, there is another website that does a lot of international stuff that gives you a different perspective, and some people might be surprised. It's Al Jazeera.
Yes, yeah, it does. Yeah, I don't-
Their coverage of the Ukraine war has actually been quite good.
They're oftentimes
It's very
good,
interesting.
and it is very different.
Yeah, Al Jazeera is very interesting, right?
Yeah.
Well, you've got to pick a couple of international papers and read them, right? Financial Times is good. I think it's a good all-around paper to read is the Financial Times, is my opinion. Maybe you could subscribe to one journal that is kind, or website that's kind to people, and the editors understand that not everyone is a political scientist. So
Yeah.
the editors of Foreign Affairs work very hard to get people like me to stop talking like we're talking to our colleagues and talk like we're talking to people who actually want to know about international affairs but don't want to be political scientists, right? So Foreign Affairs, their standard of editing is pretty good, both the website and the magazine itself. Foreign Policy is the same. It's a good one.
You like both of those. You like both of those, Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy.
Well, I'm saying ones that, a person who's interested in current affairs but doesn't want to make it their profession.
Yeah.
Right. Because if you want to make it your profession, then there's other places you can go. But I'm thinking of a person who's like a really hardcore current affairs, foreign policy kind of junkie, but who actually does something else for a living, right? Right. That's the person I'm thinking of in this answer, right?
Yeah.
And then you kind of have to watch to see if who's in town speaking. A lot of universities have open seminars, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that Stanford at CSAC, where a good many of you are there, I'm sure they're having seminars that are open to the public.
No, they do all the time.
And interesting people are talking at those seminars.
Yeah.
So, be aware of wherever you are, what's the local university doing in international relations? And then in some towns, you will find groups of people who exist, who study this. In the Bay Area, there's
There's a World Affairs.
There's a World Affairs Council. That's right. There's a World
Yeah.
Affairs Council in the
Yeah,
Bay
it was-
Area. I think it's quite active.
It is, yes, yeah.
And that's a membership organization. Anybody can sign up. I don't think Council on Foreign Relations is harder to become a member. If you want to become a member, anybody can subscribe to the journal, right?
Yeah.
Foreign Affairs has a circulation of 60 or 70,000 now, I'm told,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But being a member of the council is harder, right? You have to kind of be seconded and learn a secret handshake and others.
Yeah. Well, very fabulous presentation. Thank you so much for your time, for such a tremendous and enlightening talk, and for sharing your thoughts and perspective. Our group is truly appreciative and honored to have someone of your background and caliber give such a great presentation on grand strategy. Your insights.
Well, it's really great to be here. I love sort of carrying this kind of message, even if you don't quite agree with my critique. You now know where to find the pure milk, and you know an approach to kind of look at it and form your own opinions. And I kind of love giving the talks. I appreciate the venue and I appreciate the questions. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I learned so much every time I talk with you, and this time, about what the different things about campaigning, about the GAO saying our forces have been degrading over 20 to 30 years. I mean, this is just fabulous. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. It's getting to be 10 o'clock for me, so I know I have a full day of meetings tomorrow, so I probably better knock off for the evening.
Okay, all right. To our audience, thanks for the astute questions. There were a lot of them, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. This finishes our program for this year. And it's been I'm just stunned. This has been a great inaugural year. I thought at the beginning of the year, if we had 3 talks, it would be a home run, and we've had 5, and they've all been spectacular. We've had just great speakers, at the very top. Once again, Barry, thank you. And well, the Warriors are out of the playoffs, so go Celtics, finish with a flourish. And have a great afternoon or evening, wherever you are. Good night, everyone, and enjoy the summer. We will see you in the fall with next year's program.
All right, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.